Before I start drawing, I just want to show you this little trick quickly, and that is my black and white version of my photo, which you just saw in color and you're just about to see in color again. Now, it's not that I draw from that. I actually looked the entire time at the color photo because that gives me more information to work with. But particularly towards the end, when I was trying to make the, if you like, fine-tuning adjustments of lights and darks, I find that's when looking at a monochromatic, at a black and white version of the print in a scene such as this, wanting to create an effect such as the one I'm wanting, I find that can be really helpful. I still don't try and draw the black and white photo. In the end, I look at my drawing and I work out what's going to work best in my drawing. But it just helps me think in perhaps more accurate terms as to the way the light is affected by the direction of the sun and the topography and the objects that are in it. Now you'll see I started this drawing doing, if you like, a dotted broken line outline of the whole scene, because really I'm not really going to draw anything in this. I'm creating effects of light and dark, and the way those effects are drawn depends on how I do the hatching to create them, and how I do the hatching depends on what the hatching is going on to. But the actual edges, the outlines, I really don't intend to draw much at all, except perhaps with the big tree in a way. So I spent 4 minutes doing that dotted outline, and now I'm using, that was with a 0.1mm pen, and now I'm using a 0.5mm pen for the closest part of my drawing, which is the bottom right-hand side. Now I'm going to have to put a lot of line work down here because I want this to be very dark. This is going to anchor the light effects, if you like, the creation of light. Now, of course, I can't draw light. I can draw darkness, and the darker I draw darkness, the brighter any non-dark parts of my drawing are going to look. So it's striking that balance of not going too light so that you're endlessly having to go over things, but also not going too dark in places where it's not going to suit to go dark. Particularly in those, I think of them as transition zones between the darkest darks and more mid-values. And the other challenge is not to do too many mid-values, but where the mid-values hit the really bright lit up parts to transition to the white paper very, very quickly. So I'm using my 0.5. Now you're watching this at 8 times drawing speed. Now I know that's very fast, but this took me about 75 minutes, an hour and a quarter to draw in real time, which really is too long for a video. And you can use the cog icon to reduce this to a quarter speed, to 0.25 speed, which will bring it back to double time, and trust me, that's going to be slow enough for you to see what I'm doing and to see it well. Now, along the bottom here, I'm really wanting to get some horizontal lines in place to create contrast with the vertical lines I'm using on the rocks, and a lot of the vertical lines that I will be using for the dark value areas in the grasses. So hatching is all about reflecting the underlying form so it helps us to read what we're doing, creating the light and darknesses that we want, and also creating distinction between the various elements that are in that darkness. And one of the ways we do that is to, well, there's 2 ways I guess I do that. One is to change the direction, if at all possible, of the hatching when different elements, different forms come up next to each other. And the other is also then trying to create contrast in value as well, in the darks and the lights, or the mid values. Not to have 2 mid values or 2 very dark values up next to each other if they're totally different elements. Usually we create a greater sense of drama by having stronger contrasts next to each other. Now, you can see why I wanted to speed this up, because there was a lot of going back and forth, and I certainly haven't come anywhere near being finished with this corner yet. But this is as much as I felt I could confidently do now. All the time I need to keep pausing and looking at my drawing and thinking, where are the darker parts and what direction will I put the lines and how dark will I make them right now? Because I can't really work out the final adjustments for the lights and darks until I've drawn a lot more of this scene. Because I need to get a sense of how much white paper to leave and how much and where I just do a very few very light lines. So I've now switched to a 0.3 millimeter pen, which is to do the left-hand side in the foreground there. So from what I'm doing now, bringing that now down to the lower left, and then to do that clumpy, long, sword-like leaves plant on the right-hand side in the center there. So by reducing the size of my pen, I do two things. I end up with a finer line, which gives a sense of something being further away than something that's in front of it, drawn with a heavier line. And I also can create more nuance in the values I create with the hatching. I can get a range of lighter values more easily with a thinner line. And what I also want is to have the darkest values closest and then lighter values further back and the lightest values further back. Even if they're all dark values, the closest dark values are going to be the darkest because that echoes the effect, the visual effect we have in life. And therefore, if we capture that in our drawing, it will help add a sense of realism to our drawing. The thing I find I keep doing is I try and see the light rays coming down at the angle they're coming down, and therefore seeing what they catch and what they don't catch. And then I draw more lines on what they're not catching. So it's still using the 0.3 millimeter pen. Now, in these sorts of parts, I'm really just, I'm trying to generally capture the lights and darks. I'm not agonizing over being exact in every little part of these clumps of grasses, but I am trying to capture an effect of grasses and light and dark. You can't really work out exactly how they're going to look yet, because again, I'm nowhere near finished this section I've just done, just as I'm nowhere near finished the lower right-hand side. But because we read values against other values, there's a point where we really have to get a lot of our drawing done so that we can start then to make more final decisions about how dark the darkest parts will be and where they will be, and the lighter parts as well. So I'm drawing this with a 0.3 millimeter pen. When I go to draw what's behind this, I'll switch to a 0.2 millimeter pen. Now, I've done those vertical lines to represent the texture of the bark, the shadows in the fingers, if you like, vertical fingers of rough bark that we have on the tree. Now, again, this isn't the final darkness for the tree, but it's enough for now before I start to make adjustments. And you'll notice, though, I did take particular care with that long leaf that arches in front of the tree and catches the light. Now, that's the sort of detail where if we slow down and take time enough to do that accurately, there's a lot of other detail we don't have to worry about drawing, because that will draw the eye, and that will let the brain read a lot more detail than we've actually drawn. So there are no rules. It's what works and what creates the effect that we want. Generally, in a scene where we have a strong light effect such as this, we want as much contrast as we can between the values. So we want some really black blacks, and then we want some basically white paper really close to them in some part. And then we want some mid values, but we don't want too many. There are some parts where we don't want any transition between light and dark, and there are other parts where we'll want some, but not too much, because we're trying to keep the sense of drama, and it's the jumping from one to the other that gives us that. So here we have now this plant on the left hand side. Now I'm using the 0.3 still, the plant on the right hand side, sorry. These sorts of strappy plants can be pretty complex to draw, and I must admit I wasn't probably giving it quite as much time as I normally would. I was feeling a bit impatient with all that there was still to do, and all I can say is it does improve before the end, because all of these plants are viewed together, and particularly this dark shadow in the lower right hand side, it's really a darkness that we want to have there really strongly visually, and we want the overall depth of shadow to be the first thing we see ahead of working out what's in it, because it's this sort of diagonal slash of darkness which really defines the light in the most dramatic way. And so it's not actually necessary to be able to understand what it all is at first. But we do have some great leaves coming out, strips of whatever they are, leaves coming out in a silhouette form. And that's really important. Sorry about that. I had about 4 or 5 minutes where I didn't have my camera on. So it's appeared now, and I've switched to my 0.2mm pen. I turned the camera off while I switched pens, and that's why it happened this way. So I'm now doing the furthest parts, most of the further parts, and this is where I still want to create enough darkness so that the white, the bare paper sections that run diagonally down the center of the scene, down through the pathway where the light's hitting it, stands out more. The more white paper I have showing anywhere else on the page, the more that's going to diffuse the visual impact of where I'm wanting the light to look the strongest, where I want the highlight, where I want the drama to be. And so I hatch all of this, which is what I'm doing now, I think. Yep, you can see me hatching all of it. And I'm still going to make the tree darker, and I'm going to make everything darker, basically. And this is why these sorts of drawings are a bit of a commitment. And we have to persevere through what's been referred to as the ugly stage in a comment that I had. And I think it's so appropriate, absolutely. Persevere through the ugly stage when it's hard to see whether it's going to be anything at all, when the lines look more of a mess, more of a tangle than anything we'd hoped for. And it's really hard to see how we can bring this together and make it look half decent. That's where we need to have faith in our original vision and in our drawing journey that'll be taking us there. And this may not be the finished product, if you like. We may not get there as far as we would like in this drawing, but it will be going part of the way. In some ways, these drawings, this type of scene, is really easy once we work out how we create the effects with the hatching. But we only discover that by practicing it. This is a skill that we can't learn by looking at lots and lots and lots of videos, or lots and lots of videos of someone else doing the drawing. We have to actually experiment with the hatch lines ourselves, with the layering of hatching upon hatching, creating more complex cross-hatching effects. And that's why, particularly pay attention in the, we're probably coming up almost to the part where I start now going over the things I've already drawn with hatching. But notice how I've actually I haven't drawn shapes. I'm hatching effects of light and dark. And how would you draw this scene if you felt that you had to draw the objects? Maybe you could draw the tree and a few of the rocks, but how do you draw the light? How do you draw the ground? How do you draw the bits and pieces? How do you draw all that detail in the foreground? How do you then create the darkness? So hatching for a scene where the effects of light and dark, and the particularly natural scenes where there aren't really very many objects per se that are outlineable. Hatching is the way we do it because we draw by the values. We create the lights and the darks with our hatching and then our cross hatching over the top. So I just stuck those leaves in the upper right because I realized they are in my reference. Now, in the reference, they're backlit, but there's enough light bending around them that they're not as dark. They're not sort of the same silhouette effect as, say, that tree trunk is. However, I decided to make them as if they were because I thought that would read better and that would give me a nice contrast with the light behind. It would help them also come closer, feel closer, because darker values come closer and sharper edges come closer, and that would help give a stronger sense of depth of plane. Now, I switched to a 0.1 millimeter pen. Now I switched to a 0.1 millimeter pen for the furthest away lines that we have kind of in the upper center to upper right section behind the things I've drawn at the moment. And now I am changing pens quite a bit. I've picked up the 0.2 millimeter pen, and now I come to the perilous task of adding hatching to some of my reserved areas, the places where I've left a lot of white paper so I don't have to think too much, and so that I can capture more the overall big picture darks and lights before I start to work out exactly how much will I encroach, how little of the paper will I leave to get the effect I want. So now I'm really working on this lower right-hand corner to really increase the darkness, and yet I don't want to lose the sense of form. So that's the challenge, to still get a sense of the direction of the rocks or of the ground or of the general direction of the plant surface, whatever. And I also want a little bit of detail that we feel even more than we see in there as well. And now I realize that I hadn't actually done this sort of curving section of leaf litter partial shade or lighter shade. And that made a big difference. I think it narrowed the light and therefore concentrated the light effect and made it look brighter. So now I've got my 0.2 millimeter pen again. I probably went a little bit dark with that kind of triangular darkness there in the upper middle part. And I've also brought it down too low, which was not as obvious when I was drawing it as it is looking at it now on the camera. So now let's make the tree a little bit darker. So I've gone back to the 0.3 millimeter pen. And again, this is where I have to be really careful with that white leaf that comes in front of it, not to lose it now after all this time to establish it and to preserve it. A couple of careless hatch lines and I suddenly have it looking a lot less realistic. So while I've got that 0.3, I'm working on making those leaves a little bit darker. So now I am doing much more of the fine tuning and we're just about done. In fact, we are done. The reveal, trying hard to do it so slowly and not to tear the paper. And that's it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I find these really fun scenes to draw and they end up being easier than we think once we understand how we create the light effect and that we're drawing through values, through hatching, not through outlining shapes. Just a little bit more to go and as I said, it is fine-tuning all the time. I had thought I finished, and then I think that actually helps. So why don't you have a go doing this? You'll find the reference on my channel community page, and it may not be as hard as you think, but it will be fun, and it's certainly a great opportunity to experiment with hatching and cross-hatching. So enjoy. But whatever you draw, however you draw it, and however it looks, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.